back to the TRG seminar for another week. Thank you all for joining us again. And this week we have a really interesting session that's going to be on the Positive Play Scale. And before we get into that and the guests for this week, allow me to just give one more plug for the survey that went out, I think it was yesterday. It's, I think, a less than 5-minute survey. We just wanted to get some feedback about what your experiences have been like with the seminar and whether there are any guests or presentations that you'd like to hear from in the future. We have spent more time doing this than we thought we would initially, and we just want to make sure that we're on the right path and that we can continue delivering content that's useful for you during these odd times. So with that in mind, if you do get this email, if you signed up to get emails from us, you should be seeing that survey at some point in your inbox, and we would definitely appreciate if you could fill that out for us. Moving on, today we have a really interesting conversation set up, and it's in this area known as positive play, which in some ways is a very new area, in some ways is a very old area when it comes to responsible gambling. And we have an interesting duo set up to talk about it. So we have 2 speakers today. So Kellie Manning is the senior manager at Nova Scotia Gaming and Lottery Corporation, and she has been implementing positive play research as well as positive play related operations into the day-to-day at her organization, and she's going to be able to share some of her experiences dealing with these concepts and showing us how they can be used in a business setting. And to kick us off with our opening presentation is Dr. Richard Wood. Dr. Richard Wood, many of you know well. He's from GamRes, GamGuard. He's held academic positions. He's consulted with many different organizations. But first and foremost, for the conversation today, he's the person who is behind the development of the positive play scale and was doing research in positive play well before the scale. So with that introduction in mind, what I'm going to do is hand the conversation over to Richard to first give us a presentation to make sure that we're all level set for the day. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kahlil. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to give you a bit of a background on positive play, what it is, and some of the more recent developments. So I shall move to my presentation. Here we go. Yeah, so what's positive play? Well, it's a kind of new take, I suppose, on responsible gambling. I mean, I've been in sort of the responsible gambling research area for sort of 20-something years, I think. And when it first started out, it was there wasn't that much interest in it. There was a few sort of conscientious gambling operators that were showing a little bit of interest, a few kind of researchers that wanted to do some stuff. And but over the years, it's kind of spiraled into a huge research area. Lots of really interesting studies have taken place. And it's something that pretty much every gambling operator does now. It's, you know, an expectation. But what I kind of noticed over that time is that the focus really has been very much on problematic gambling and, you know, how to minimize it. You know, and of course that makes sense because, you know, there's a lot of research on problem gambling. It's a big sort of social issue. Nobody wants to have problem gambling. And so the focus really has been how to minimize that. The problem there is, though, of course, that it's left responsible gambling with a bit of an image problem. So, oops. We try and advance. There we go. So I think, you know, often if you ask players in particular, what is responsible gambling? Often this kind of image will appear in their minds. It's a sort of paternalistic, don't do this, otherwise, or if you do this wrong, you will develop a gambling problem, bad things will happen. And so, there have been studies that have shown that if you ask what does responsible gambling mean to you as a player, people will often say, well, it's about gambling problems. It's not really relevant for me. And so this image problem has often led to a kind of feelings of irrelevance, and players haven't sort of engaged with a lot of the responsible gambling tools and initiatives. So I guess positive play in its first sense was about trying to reframe responsible gambling and make it a little more relevant to sort of everyday players. And so my sort of first foray into this area was back in 2013 in a study that I did with Camelot in the UK. And we wanted to look at responsible gambling from the player's perspective. And we wanted to understand, what does responsible play actually look like? But we didn't want to use the term responsible play for the reasons that I've just listed, because players weren't really engaging with that. And so we came up with the term positive play. So the idea was to look at what is it that players are doing right? What are the responsible players doing? What can we learn from that? And how can we then promote that to the rest of the players? So it's more of a kind of carrot-based approach than this traditional kind of stick-based approach. And so, when we're talking about positive play, what we're really talking about is responsible gambling from the player's perspective. It's the things that they're doing right. And, the language is very important. If we want players to engage with it, with responsible gambling features, we need to be very cognizant of the terms that we use. And so, personally, I don't think responsible gambling is a very good term to use with players. I would suggest we use positive play, but it also encompasses the sort of the broader spectrum of language that surrounds responsible gambling and positive play. If we think about things like budgets and limits, they don't sound like a very fun thing to do. If we think about tools, player tools, what are tools? They're things that people do work with. And so if we want players to engage, we need to think about how responsible gambling is presented. So that's one of the major areas of positive play, reframing it. The second area is to do with measuring positive play or measuring responsible gambling. And so traditionally, the way this has been done in the past is by looking at these people. So these are the people with gambling problems. And so, you look over time and you see if the responsible gambling initiatives are having an impact by looking at the numbers of people who have issues. But of course, the problem here is that the number of people with gambling problems is actually very low. So compared to the rest of the player population. So you're looking at very small numbers of players. So it's very difficult to see kind of nuanced differences, to look at differences between different players. And of course, problem gambling rates tend to be fairly stable over time. Often somebody will have a gambling problem throughout their life, or at least for many years. So then trying to see how responsible gambling initiatives can impact that is kind of very difficult, because it's not a sensitive change. And of course, by looking at these players, it tells us very little about what the vast majority of players are doing. So in deciding to measure positive play, what we decided to do was to look at these players. And these are the vast majority of players who, on the whole, don't have any problems. And so by looking at the sort of 90, 98, 99%, we can then see much more sort of subtle differences in their play and learn a lot more about what works as opposed to what doesn't work. And so the positive play approach and measuring positive play is a kind of more of a proactive approach as opposed to the reactive approach, which is responding to, gambling problems. So to this end, some colleagues and myself, so shout out here to Michael Wohl, Nassim Tabri, and of course Kahlil as well, who was involved in the development of the Positive Play Scale. We decided to develop a scale which would measure positive play amongst players. And so we initially started this work in British Columbia with the help of the British Columbia Lottery Corporation. And then subsequently, we've tested this scale all the way across Canada to validate it. And we've used it in, I believe, 7 US states now. We've used it in New Zealand, in the UK, and it's also been used by another group in Macau. And so the Positive Play Scale has 2 belief subscales. The first one is personal responsibility. So this really taps into how much players believe it's their responsibility to, only spend what they can afford and take responsibility for their own play rather than sort of externalize it. And the second belief subscale is gambling literacy. So this is the extent to which players have a good understanding of the games that they play, whether they have any erroneous perceptions about gambling or, they have a good understanding of the nature of randomness and chance and so on. And then the Positive Play Scale also has 2 behavior scales. So there's honesty and control, so the extent to which players are honest with themselves and others about the nature of their play and whether they feel in control. And then pre-commitment. So this is the extent to which they think about how much time or money they should spend before they play. So it might include using things like limit setting tools, but really it's about the sort of having that sort of internal dialogue about, can I afford to do this before they play? And so these 4 subscales make up the Positive Play Scale. And this allows us to do, using this in player populations, is, we can determine how many players are scoring high, medium, and low, and we can identify which of these subscales are scoring the highest and the lowest. So typically we found that gambling literacy tends to score quite low, and honesty and control score quite high. It varies, of course, between different jurisdictions. And so what this means is then that, a gambling operator or another stakeholder can start to focus their resources and their attention and their research into trying to bolster gambling literacy. And maybe they don't need to do so much on personal responsibility or honesty and control. And also means we can start to segment and look at different players and see how they score. And so a typical finding is that we found that younger players tend to score a lot lower than older players. So, in a nutshell, then the Positive Play Scale is a way to measure responsible gambling, the outcome of responsible gambling strategy amongst different players and different player segments, and to look at the different areas that together make up what we know as responsible gambling. And that's all I want to say at the moment. So I shall hand you back to Kahlil, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And I really appreciate you giving that overview. And I like how you really brought it together at the end, which is the idea that it's really that outcome variable that we're trying to look at from a responsible gambling perspective. And that's what drew me to that concept when you initially mentioned it to me, and still is the reason why I think there's a lot of value in it right now. I'm going to pass the conversation now over to Kellie Manning, who is somebody that I previously worked with as well, but has been working with the Positive Play Scale for much longer than I have, and has a lot of interesting perspectives to share. So, Kellie, I know we had some troubles trying to get your slides up and down. You might not be able to share everything that you want to, but I'm sure you can fill in the details one way or another. So, Kellie, tell us about your experiences, please.
Sure. What I might do, just because I had a couple of glitches there, is just speak to the text, if that's okay. Just in terms of my I'm awaiting a computer upgrade. So in the interest of that, I'll stick to Zoom Basic. So Positive Play. So in Nova Scotia, the way Positive Play came into play for us is our Responsible Gambling Awareness Week, which has been around since 2002, was one of the first in North America to come on the scene. And basically it's about promoting historically responsible gambling and as well. It's a bit of around support of regulated gambling, informed player choice, that kind of thing. In terms of when we first became introduced to Positive Play, I think we were aware of the work that Dr. Wood had done with Camelot. And then in 2017, there was the Canadian validation study that was done. So as part of that, each jurisdiction had a decent sample size. So in Nova Scotia, I think we had around 1,000 players who were surveyed. So we had this kind of great data to work with. So in terms of heading into our planning for our awareness week in 2018, which is a bit more like a month, we talk about a week, but we're in market for a good chunk of time. We started incorporating some of the learnings from Positive Play in terms of how we were targeting our awareness activities. So in that instance, we decided to focus the campaign on 19 to 34 audience, and we also had a fair number of conversations with Dr. Wood just about what we should be considering when coming up with profiles and how to target kind of awareness and education with that group. So some of the considerations we're thinking that younger players in general are more likely to endorse the role of luck in comparison to older players, and younger players in general are more likely to gamble for financial gain. So, for example, to try and win money. So these are some of the considerations that we had kind of out of the gate. And the great thing about Positive Play as well is when you're working with an agency is it's just very digestible. And I think for those outside of the the kind of purely academic realm, I think that the ability for a simpler knowledge transfer of the concept, I think is just very, very helpful. So we came away with that 2017 data, and then with input from Dr. Wood and Kahlil. I think you were involved with that as well. Just consider a couple of key focuses, which included things like messages should be aimed at improving the Positive Play experiences. So it shouldn't be about negative warnings. I think Richard, you had the slide with the wagging finger and about problem gambling consequences, and really keep messages cognitively simple whenever possible. So those were a couple of things that we really embraced, as well as a lot of the standard messages that go along with responsible gambling. Play to be entertained, and winning is not predictable. And really what we settled on as a big focus was players who understand the game and set limits are more satisfied with their playing experiences. So this theme of know the game emerged. There was also some conversation around from the Positive Play work, just words and things to avoid. And I can't say that we completely adhered to all of these recommendations, because it became pretty hard to not talk about limits or rules or that kind of thing. But just being wary of venturing into the realm of skill or luck or dreams, big wins, and even extreme personality types. So just trying to find a way kind of into the conversation with these 19 to 34-year-olds that is going to resonate. So what's been exciting is that the last 2 years we've been building these campaigns really based on the learnings from Positive Play. Not to say that they're not kind of vastly different from where we were before, but I think it provides us with just some extra credibility and extra, I guess, ability to fine tune what we're doing. Then in 2020, this past little while, we issued an RFP for a year-round gambling literacy campaign. And what's exciting is, in the RFP, we actually talked about Positive Play. So for those agencies kind of competing for the business, they actually took the time to learn about Positive Play. And based on the responses, I got the sense that it, again, from that perspective of being, digestible and kind of simple from a knowledge transfer perspective, that it was, easy to grasp, and that those responding, were able to incorporate some of the basic learnings into some of their proposals. Just because I can't share the creative with you exactly, and it might be hard to do a bit of a show and tell, but we basically landed on kind of lovely kind of cinematic portraits of individuals who are talking about either, one is a barber, she can perfect a haircut, but she knows that she can't perfect her lottery play. So we've got another one who's a beachcomber, and again, very heavy Nova Scotian scenery, which we like to see for that local audience, who loves, hunting for driftwood on the beach, and he knows the longer he looks for his driftwood, the more likely he'll find a perfect piece. But unlike gambling, the longer you play, it's not going to impact the outcomes. And I can share a link on the chat or the YouTube comments afterwards, perhaps, for the website if folks want to check out the videos. They're very lively and snappy. And this past year, we even went to a more almost like somewhere between like a meme and an animated GIF in terms of a know the game approach. These little mini ads that played on social that actually did very well. For anyone in the office over the age of 27, they seemed very random and disjointed, but they actually resonated really well with the audience. From an evaluation perspective, historically, we've done the last 5 or 6 years an online survey and have asked questions about the campaign resonating, that sort of thing. So we've continued with those same measures. What we've added in the last couple of years around gambling literacy and positive play are basically and I'm sure there's an evaluation term for this official, but basically, do a pre questions around gambling literacy, show the content, and then administer the questions again. And we did see in terms of the gambling literacy questions, advertising lift in terms of all of those responses from that evaluation, which is really neat to see. And we've seen that fairly consistently over the last couple of years. From an evaluation perspective, now we're looking at redoing the baseline for Nova Scotia this fall, and we'd be doing the full positive play scale here as well, just to tune things up. So overall, it's been a great tool for us. Again, I feel like it adds another dimension. We do quarterly surveillance work here in Nova Scotia, and we still consider that very important, and we're not losing sight of that. At the same time, positive play just adds another dimension, and has been very helpful to us the past couple of years and moving forward, which we're excited about.
Well, thanks very much, Kellie. That was a really great and comprehensive overview. If I were to try to summarize what you've said, it sounds like there's a couple of bundles where the scale gets used in your organization. So one is getting a baseline and then understanding how your organization might be moving as a whole in one direction or another. And then the other was just evaluating specific interventions that you might have, whether that's an education program or something else, and comparing that to specific parts of the scale. So in certain subscales, you might have a targeted intervention. Is that about right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So glad I was able to summarize that. If you were to try to advise like a different organization about where to start with the positive play scale, is there any advice that you might give somebody who's in your role in a different organization who's might find this intuitively appealing? Where should they start when it comes to the positive play scale?
Well, if I didn't know anything about it, or if I was speaking to someone, I would say, there's lots of great reading online. So check out, there's some great presentations that Richard's given at past conferences and whatnot. So, do a bit of reading, check it out. I would say as well, reach out to Richard. We've kind of moved from in 2018. I'll be very honest. There were moments where we're kind of, the plane is on the runway. We've got a script for video, and it was, okay, Richard, could you take a peek at this? And we'd have some final tune-ups. Whereas with the gambling, the year-round strategy now, we're actually involving Richard in more of the conversations as we build it. So my advice would be kind of read up on it and explore. In this instance, engage the expert directly if you can for some conversations, because I think there's a lot of interest there, I think, to be engaged, which is great. And I would say be open and creative. It's a relatively new It's a relatively new tool, and it's very user friendly. So I would just say look for ways to incorporate it. We're chatting now about, is there a way to even look at measuring the positive play of retailers, which might be kind of interesting to see and how they're different. So I think it's an exciting frontier for a new tool. So I would just say be engaged about it and be open.
Well, great. So, Richard, I have a question queued up for you, but I want to address another question that's come up in the chat as well, perhaps simultaneously. So this came from David Zendel, but Oliver also asked about it. And I know it's probably something on other people's minds because it's a question you get asked a lot. So David puts it in this way: if positive play is a good way to measure responsible gambling, positive players should not be problem gamblers. Do we know what proportion of people who score high on the positive play also have problems? So this is a question: is this just the opposite of a problem gambling scale? And I guess I'll put that question to you. And then the other question that I had queued up was, where should the guardrails be put in place and how this used? So what are the limitations of the positive play scale? I think those two things are connected, but perhaps you think otherwise.
Yeah, thanks, Kahlil. These are both good questions, interesting topics. Yeah, so is positive play just the opposite of problem gambling? And so, I think one of our concerns when we were developing this scale is, are we just going to end up with an inverted PGSI? And then, what is the value of that? And so what we've actually found is that there's a sort of partial correlation between PPS scores and PGSI scores. So typically, somebody who scores high on the positive play scale, so they're a very responsible player, tends to score very low on the PGSI because they're not really mutually incompatible. You can't be a responsible player and have gambling related issues. So that was a sigh of relief from us all, because obviously that makes a lot of sense. But the inverse is not necessarily true. So if somebody scored low on the positive play scale, they don't necessarily score high on something like the PGSI. And so there could be several reasons for this. So, for example, maybe they may have some misconceptions or concerns about the way that they play, but they perhaps don't play frequently enough for that to be an issue. Or maybe they just started playing and it's not something that emerged. I mean, we could speculate that perhaps they're on a more risky trajectory, but they're definitely not scoring as problematic. And then when we looked at the subscales, I believe honesty and control was the one that was most closely correlated with PGSI, which I think makes a lot of sense, that whether you feel in control and so on. So there's a partial correlation, but they're measuring different things essentially. So that was quite good. And then the second part was, what were the limitations? What are the limits of the positive play scale? Yeah, so I mean, I think the first limitation is to recognize that this isn't a proxy measure of problem gambling. I think it says a lot about player health and about whether players are doing things right. And it could, if you had lots of players scoring very low, particularly on honesty and control, I think you might have some concerns. But really, it's about more this sort of the positive side of things and where your responsible gambling strategy can be improved. But obviously, it has its limitations. We're measuring the outcomes of responsible gambling strategy, what players do, but that's just part of the story, really. So I mean, I think for a responsible gambling strategy, you've got to look broader. You've got to look at things like the appeal of your products and your advertising to children and vulnerable players. That's not something that the positive play scale looks at. Game design, I think you mentioned GamGuard earlier. So I mean, which is a tool for measuring how risky individual games are and determining whether some types of games are riskier than others. That's not really something that we look at with positive play. Although we have found that players on some types of games often show sort of lower PPS scores. But the difficulty there is that players often play on lots of different game types. So that can be difficult to kind of untangle. I think another area which is always very useful to look at that we don't kind of look at much with positive play is things like unintended consequences. And this is why I always think it's good to do some things like, focus groups and have player panels and talk to players and try to understand things from their perspective. I think as researchers, we like to think we have a great understanding of where players are coming from and what gambling means to them. But sometimes, we don't see things the way that players see them, So, for example, you might have a behavioral feedback tool that tells players, how they're, how much they're winning and losing and how their playing has changed over time. And we think, oh, that's a great tool for players to, moderate their play. And then some players might be thinking, oh, this is a great tool for me to figure out when my next win is due. So, I think we always have to be mindful of those kinds of unintended consequences. And also, I think, we need to test individual responsible gambling features. The positive play scale is good for testing sort of the overall strategy and how well players are doing. But we also need to look at, the effectiveness of individual tools. Does that limit setting tool work? Is that education campaign hitting home? Are the pop-ups having the right kinds of effects? So, yeah, it's one of many tools that I think we need to apply to make responsible gambling effective.
Well, thanks, Richard. And I think there's a lot to dig into there, but I want to flip the conversation over to Kellie for a moment. And I want to ask you, Kellie, just a question, not about the positive play scale, but just about positive play more broadly as a concept. So in your experiences, either in Nova Scotia or with colleagues or anywhere else, does positive play matter? I guess is a question I'm trying to ask. Have you found any evidence that it really matters for harms? Or does it have any impact on revenue? Does it have any impact on customer satisfaction? Have you, in your experiences, found any evidence that supports that this actually is something that is meaningful? I think we have a good sense that it's measuring something, but is that something actually meaningful for other outcomes that we're most interested in?
Well, I would say, in terms of capital E evidence, no, we haven't done any, any direct research on those specific impacts. But what I will say is that we feel as though the let's say like the values, but the sentiment around positive play is very aligned with where we've always come from a social responsibility perspective. So for us, it's really in line with really what we've always been trying to achieve. But I think it really, again, is able to provide a metric. So no, there isn't really. We don't have any data around correlation exactly to a reduction in harms or any kind of I guess like revenue impacts. But it's also early days for us. So maybe sometime in the future.
Can I follow up on that?
Absolutely.
Kahlil? Yeah, so this is an interesting area, and so it's not something that we looked at initially, but more recently we have, with some of the studies that we've done in the States and New Zealand and in the UK, we actually included a question about players' satisfaction with their gambling, and then we looked at that in comparison to their PPS scores. And what we actually found was that those players that scored the highest on the PPS, so the most positive players, were also the most satisfied players, which I think was quite sort of, gratifying. So, responsible gambling doesn't seem to be spoiling all the fun, which is a good message. And I think it kind of makes sense, in a way. Positive play is measuring a kind of like level of comfort with gambling and sort of like overall psychological well-being. Perhaps these players don't have concerns about their play. They're quite happy with where it's going. So I think it kind of makes sense from that perspective.
Yeah, that's intuitively feels right to me as well. And before we go on, I just want to say thank you to everybody who's bearing with us. We're on our backup streaming service, and so things might be a little bit choppy, but we're glad we can still get content out. I want to defer to a question that Spencer asked earlier in this conversation. That was on the nature of this being, like a really player-specific measure, and whether or not there's going to be differences across different population groups. And I'll put this question to both of you. So, Richard, in a minute, I'll ask you to talk about the interjurisdictional impacts. But Kellie, I'm curious, what have your experiences been in terms of the differences perhaps across product categories or different aspects of your business?
Well, I would say overall, like our focus at this point is more on the age range. Like that's, I think, in the Nova Scotian data, and I think it's in the Canadian too. That was sort of the largest or the most significant common denominator was that younger age range in terms of opportunity for improvement. But for sure, there are differences across.
And we seem to have lost audio on Kellie just right now, so I'll perhaps hand the conversation over to Richard, and then perhaps we can reconnect with Kellie if we can get that audio back online. So Richard, would you perhaps try to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and yeah. So I mean, I guess one of our concerns when we develop this scale is it going to measure differences between different jurisdictions? Because what if everybody just scored the same thing, and then it wouldn't be much use as a scale, would it? Anyway, so the good news is that we did find quite big differences. I mean, I think across Canada as a whole, there was a lot of similarity, and I think that probably speaks to the fact that there's a lot of sharing of best practice in Canada, and a lot of similarities between the operators and the way they do things. But when we started comparing with other sort of broader jurisdictions, like when we look at the aggregated data for the studies that we've done in the US, we found that actually Canada was scoring a lot higher on all of the scales than those scores in the US. And we found various differences in other countries as well. That was one of the most pronounced. And I mean, why would that be? I mean, I think intuitively, I would say it speaks to the level of investment in responsible gambling in Canada compared to the US. I mean, I always think sort of Canada and Scandinavia are kind of right at the top in terms of their involvement with responsible gambling and investing in it and being proactive. And I think in Canada, there is a lot of sharing of best practice. I think in the States, it's catching up, it's getting there, but they tend to have a lot lower budgets for this kind of thing, responsible gambling generally, and not quite so much sharing. And so, so far it does appear to be differentiating between those different jurisdictions, which is good. And as I think as Kellie was pointing out, it differentiates between the different player segments in each jurisdiction as well. So typically we found younger players scoring lower on pretty much every subscale of the positive play. And I think that kind of makes sense as well. Younger people have less experience, they've had less player education, being young is a time for risk taking generally, those sorts of things. But we're also seeing group differences amongst different types of players. Depending on the games that they play, that's a little more difficult to examine because often players will play several games. But we actually did some cluster analysis, and we found that one of the sort of predictors was there was a difference between those that mostly played lottery games and those that played sort of lottery games plus other more continuous forms of gambling, like sort of slots and casino games. And it was also moderated by frequency of play as well. So those that played the most game types and the highest frequency were kind of scoring the lowest. So that was interesting. And it wasn't just about frequency, it was about game types as well. And I think that's something we want to explore a little more in the kind of, the next phases of the research.
Yeah, and I know that there is a lot more research to be done. I think we have Kellie back with us, and hopefully the sound is working again. So we'll see about that. But Kellie, I just want to see if you have any thoughts that you wanted to add or that you weren't able to throw in before you got cut off unceremoniously by the technical difficulties. And then to follow that up, I was wondering if you could perhaps comment on a question that we got from Ray Cho, which was basically what's next. Where do you see the application of this, or what type of research or application you might be interested in? And I know you're involved with a cross Canada group that does a lot of investment in these types of projects. So is there anything that you can share as far as what you hope to be able to do in this this research area, but also operational area in the future?
Oh, fair enough. When in Nova Scotia, we do have a target around gambling literacy in our business plan. So we'll be looking to increase that. So we've made a commitment, at least internally, in terms of our plans there to make headway on a national level. So with the Canadian Responsible Gambling Association, there are some conversations about some further work around positive play, and I think it's definitely something we're also really we're proud that it's coming out of Canada as well. So not only on the merit of the tool, but I think it's great to support kind of homegrown as well. But yeah, no specific projects that I can speak of in terms of what's next. But in Nova Scotia, it's really focusing on the year-round, moving to a multi-year strategy, and we'll be developing an evaluation plan to go along with that as well.
That's great. And Richard, I'm going to ask you perhaps the same question, but I imagine you'll have a different response. I know we probably have about 10 minutes left, and so that's about one Richard Wood response. Richard, where do you see the next phase of research, or where do you want to take the next phase of research in the positive play?
Oh, where do I start, Kahlil? There's so many, like a wish list, isn't it? Christmas list of all the things I want to do. I think one of the first things really is, okay, so we're kind of like identifying the strengths and weaknesses of responsible gambling strategy. We've like identified gambling literacy as one area. I think one of the next big questions is, how do we then affect those changes? What are the most effective messages? How do we get through to players, and how do they work for different player segments as well? So we've been looking a lot at sort of like behavioral economics and the nudging and sort of like normative influence, feeding back to players about what the majority of players are doing. And so that's really kind of a new sort of frontier, I think, in terms of, figuring out how we shift these scores up. And, the work that we've been doing with Kellie in Nova Scotia, I think is along those lines, and, looks very promising. And I'm really looking forward to the next phase where we're doing this kind of pre and post to see how effective those messages are. So that's one area, really kind of like defining the education and the messaging. Also, I think looking at the relationship with sort of actual observed behavior, looking at player data from things like player cards and seeing how that corresponds to the self-report data is another area that's going to be very interesting. And, are there sort of like behavioral proxies that we can use it instead of that behavioral data, which could be very informative. Also, maybe feeding back to players on an individual level. So, we've been looking at sort of like, community level and, the whole sort of population of players. But what if we fed back individual scores to individual players? How illuminating would that be? Would players, get something from that? Would they be able to learn something from that individually? So that's another area. And sort of getting back to the whole notion of engagement, we have all these wonderful responsible gambling tools out there. How do we get players to use them? I think rewarding positive play is something that we should start to look at. There's a really good example in Finland. They developed something called Vekaus points, where players that sort of set limits or watch a video about how to play responsibly. These types of things, they get rewarded, and it's shown to be very effective in terms of getting those players to engage with those tools and have a better understanding of responsible gambling. Of course, we have to be very careful that we're not just rewarding them with more gambling, but the way they've done that is to offer things like refreshments or merchandise, that sort of thing, and they kind of made it into a sort of more fun, gamified way of doing things. And I think another sort of allied area of responsible gambling and positive play we should look at is how do we make all this stuff more of the whole gambling experience? Because people gamble because they want to have fun, and too often the responsible gambling things seem like something that's been bolted on afterwards to spoil all the fun. And what we really want to be doing is helping them to have better but healthier playing experiences. So I think anything that we can learn about how to integrate responsible gambling into the overall playing experience is going to be valuable as well.
Well, thanks, Richard. We have a couple of questions from Oliver and from Matthew, Tom, that I think are probably a little bit too technical, but I'll actually just point them in the direction of Richard's email address, which is in the show notes, if they want to follow up with those questions. But for the time being, Kellie, I just want to see if you have any closing comments that you would like to make before we go.
Yeah, I think just that for Nova Scotia, we continue to have our traditional measures in place and are committed to those. But I think for us, positive play it's adding another dimension for us. And I think especially when you're working with outside organizations and agencies and folks who might not be coming from the academic world, that it's had significant value for us. And I'm really excited to see where it's going to go next and the work in some of the other jurisdictions as well. And there are a few other provinces as well definitely using positive play. So I think as we are able to build kind of more data over time, it'll be really interesting to see just how things develop. So overall, I feel very optimistic about it.
Thank you very much. Richard, any closing comments from you?
Was that any closing comments from me?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. It's been a great experience, and I always want to sort of like put research into practice. That's my thing. I hate this sort of notion that only academics have access to the research we do, and seeing that it's being used and has value, I think is great. And I know there's been a fair amount of controversy in our field recently about working together with operators, but I think this is a good example of how we can work alongside gambling operators to improve the situation for players generally and minimize gambling harms, because we don't have competing interests. We're working towards the same thing here, which is that we want to try and develop things which are going to reduce the risk of gambling problems and help players to have healthier playing experiences overall. And so I think there are ways that we can navigate between researchers on the one hand and the gambling industry on the other to come up with really solid academic results that have real world impacts as well.
Yeah, and obviously this isn't the whole point of this conversation today, but I think the fact that somebody like you, who is a very well respected academic in an academic institution, then when moved into a different private sector role in some capacities and had to do this work, but perhaps would be not treated the same if you were in an academic institution. And that's a conversation worth having. It's one I think that we've touched on a few times in this seminar, and probably that we will in the future, but I appreciate you bringing that up again. And I appreciate both of you joining us on the seminar this week. Obviously, this is a topic that has been of great interest to me, and so I'm glad that we were able to share at least some insight about it inside of these 60 minutes this week. And I want to thank you both for joining us as part of this conversation. I also want to thank everybody who joined us to listen to this conversation and for patiently dealing with all of the technical issues that we've run into this week. We hope to have those squared away by next week, but we'll just navigate those as they come up. Next week, we will be having a conversation again on, this is actually going to be on online therapy, and we have two recent PhD grads who are ECRs. We have Dylan Pickering from University of Sydney, and also from the University of Sydney will be Frank Iorfino. And so it will be a very interesting conversation on how to digitize treatment and recovery that will be hosted by Sally. So with that in mind, thank you to the Brain and Mind Center, and thank you to Harrison Stein for your assistance as always in producing this. You will, if you have not received that survey, we may be posting that survey in a link in the comments section right now. So if you haven't filled it out and you have 5 minutes, please go ahead and do so. We would very much appreciate it. But with all that in mind, we will thank you again for joining us this week, and we will see you again next week.
Perfect. Thank you, Kahlil.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.